Hi, everybody. Welcome. All right. So today is a class designed for all levels, but it's especially beginner friendly. So I hope you guys all enjoy. This is kind of like a great summary of everything that we do with a vocal practice and sort of what makes a vocal practice and why we have it. So hopefully this will help you get into singing if you've never done it before. And if you do it, it's just a good reminder to get back to the fundamentals, get back to your practice, and make sure that you're really engaging with your body in the right way in order to elicit vocal growth. And we're going to talk about like what does it mean to grow the voice too. So you know, it's always good to get a sense of like a foundation here. What are we talking about? When we're doing a vocal practice and we're trying to grow our voice, there's a couple things that we can think about. The obvious one is range. So thinking like how low and how high can I sing? Like that makes a lot of sense, obviously. Some of the other things that we may not think about are how do we grow our voice in terms of fullness or richness of tone, depth of tone, and also, of course, volume. How much impact can our voice have in a space and the size of our voice as well. And so we'll talk about those subtleties and sort of why we do certain things in the practice to elicit certain kinds of growth. So let's talk about sort of what we do. A lot of the idea here is we're trying to stimulate the body so that we can condition certain specific muscles and keep all the other ones that aren't supposed to be involved very relaxed. And so I try to show this a lot of the times in these things. When we're performing and we're being really expressive, like we do all sorts of stuff with our face, and sometimes singers do all this kind of gesticulation and such. And you can do that once you have a good sense of how to control the internal process, but it can be really confusing for a beginning singer. Actually, one of the first things you want to do is practice staying very, very relaxed and making sure that you're just isolating the right kinds of muscles. So that's why sometimes I'm going to make a much more neutral face to show you these kinds of things. Hi, welcome. So let's go through the practice. I generally think of it as different phases of how we wake up our voice and different parts we want to keep track of, zones of the voice. And there's different kinds of exercises we can substitute into each sort of category. Again, it's always nice to have a framework, and we want to judge our voice from week to week and see if we're getting growth in the right sort of categories and ways that we want our voice to grow. So that's kind of the main thing here. Just before we get started, I want to mention that vocal growth happens slowly over time. And most of the time, when we try to rush that process, we end up injuring ourselves or fatiguing ourselves. And then we have to stop and rest. It's very much like a physical sport or any sort of athletic endeavor when you're weightlifting. Sometimes when we overwork certain things and we don't get a well rounded practice, we can start to get into imbalance issues, and then we are more likely to maybe not have an effect on our voice or our body. And this extended metaphor, I love that, of course. Sometimes we aren't able to get the effect that we want, and we want to judge it with a practice. And so this is why I talk about the nature of a practice and why we do some of these odd types of exercises. So I'm going to go a little more into detail about some of the reasons behind them, though they might seem kind of like silly sound shapes. It's to isolate certain muscles. So the first thing that I do is I think about my body awareness. The voice is all about the mind body connection, and we tend to hold a lot of tension for a lot of reasons. So I just plug it again and again. Sometimes the best thing you can do for your voice is actually do some sort of stretch or self care routine, especially right before and right after, and sometimes even during a singing practice. So I'm just going to go through some of those things. There's some simple concepts here. Some of them are just, get a self-care tool. I have one of those like Theraguns, right? And I'll just sort of run along the outside of my neck sometimes into the shoulder areas. If you don't have one of those kinds of tools, you can always use your hands. So I talk about doing this, going behind your head and trying to work on some of these back of the head muscles. And you can start to kind of squeeze and massage certain areas along the outside of the neck. You want to be a little more careful on the front. Sometimes we do self-laryngeal massage and such, and same thing with the Theragun. Like we obviously don't want to put that right here; it's a little too delicate. So we do it on these outside muscles that can get kind of hunched and tired and really tight. So to bare minimum, I'm getting people in lessons to make sure that they have some spinal mobility, and not that's not to be taken for granted, sometimes when you're exercising too much or all sorts of reasons, you realize this area is pretty stuck, and that's going to start to influence what we do with our voice. So first and foremost, shake it out, get loose. Sometimes people like to put their arms behind their back and do kind of stretches like this, right? Where you're kind of waking it up that way, sideways, opening up the ribs. And I talk about this one kind of stretch every once in a while, which looks a little awkward, but can feel really great if you have a lot of tension here. It's called a sternocleidomastoid style stretch. Put my arm behind my back and I turn my head up and over to the side. And so we're getting this angle right here. And then you're going to want to take in a breath and start to kind of pivot here as you relax your jaw and sort of like yawn. And then you're going to do that on either side. Well, like I can tell this side's a little tighter than the other one. And I'm starting to create some distance between my shoulder and this sort of jaw area. Of course, massaging right behind here and right in that sort of jaw muscle is going to be really helpful as well. But there's also other things that you can do that can help you relax your body. Even just sitting there and having a moment of meditation, of body awareness and scanning, I'll do that. And I kind of did that before this. I'll sit there and I'll just make sure that as you take my breath, I can kind of just feel what's happening in different parts of my body and make little micro adjustments in order. Oh, my jaw got really tight. So kind of wiggle it around and let it just sort of sit for a sec. Then you can do stuff like this too, tapping. And you might think this is silly, but it actually can really help you become aware and sort of get some tingly sensations in your body. It just primes our nervous system for singing so that we're extra aware of any like habits and things that we're doing that are unnecessary as we do our practice. So I will do like facial tapping, right on here on that forehead, right? That can be an area that can get really tight as we try to find higher pitches and things like that. Releasing the jaw, all of this kind of stuff. And you're going to feel a little bit of a tingle, actually. You can keep doing this all the way down your body, of course. And you're just going to start to have a better map and awareness and feel that buzz. So this is this first part of the process, which is being aware of our body as a whole, any tension that's accumulating, and just trying to get in our body. It might be like doing a little bit of exercise, like walking around the block. Any of these kinds of things can help you. So you'll notice a lot of singers will do this right before they'll sometimes shake it out. And I think part of that is to really just start to get in our bodies more, because sometimes we're doing all sorts of activities and we can be really stuck in our head and it's hard to get to the next step if that's really, really tight. So the next concept is our breath. We want diaphragmatic breathing, and this gets a little confusing. It's essentially just breathing with our belly and our back expanding. You're going to feel everything drop down. And as you exhale, you can actually use that release to continue to soften these muscles and feel that sort of warm air. We're trying to disconnect and relax everything here in our face. In general, when we try to over engage anything here, we're going to start to actually diminish the size of our voice and create some tension and strain. So in general, we're actually trying to get out of the way here. That's why doing lots of stuff to massage and relax this area. And you can do it through your breath as well. So I'm breathing low. I'm just doing a basic diaphragmatic breath. So even this, it might seem, oh, that's obvious and simple, but we're actually strengthening the muscles in our whole breathing system when we try to actually do it from down here. So we're like, right, and it actually takes some physical effort and thought at first to really get some diaphragmatic breathing. So you can just sit here for a number of minutes and breathe low and then relax and soften into it. And by actually spending some time and practicing that, and I'm going to go over it quickly, but I just try to mention this because in your own practice, you might find you linger in some of these phases, and that's totally great, especially in the early phases. When we get into singing stuff, we want to be careful about how much we do in general, and we try to make sure that it's just consistency throughout the week or every week or so, rather than like spending hours and hours working on one particular thing. But this stuff is all fair game. In fact, I recommend doing it for all sorts of reasons. So we're breathing low and we're exercising our diaphragm. Essentially, what happens is when we let our belly and our back expand, it's bringing our diaphragm, which is right by our ribs, and it pulls it all flat and engages it, and then it relaxes back up and pulls it flat and relaxes it. So we're actually doing a physical exercise through that breath. And you'll find that it starts to get a little deeper, it broadens out, and you sink into it and you start to relax, right? It starts also priming our nervous system. So these two things are not to be taken for granted. And I really do recommend that you actually spend time on it. It's the fundamental to everything. When in doubt, when you're starting to overwork in other parts of the practice, come back to this, release any muscles that are holding as we start to kind of work towards stuff, and try to find and center your breath again. So deep diaphragmatic breathing. The difference, right, is if I'm doing another kind of breathing, clavicular breathing, it's going to come from up here, and it's totally fair game throughout the day. We breathe like this all the time, even when we're exercising, right, we're out of breath. This starts to happen. In fact, that's part of it. Is it's actually pretty efficient, but we can't control our air very much from that kind of breathing. So we want to think of horizontal. We practice that and we get that sensation in our body. So that's the second phase, which is working on our breath. And then I start to talk about how we do our sort of exhale and create pressure. So here we're actually starting to exercise our lower abdominal muscles, and they help us sort of deal with our breath support and our pressure. And what it is really resistance of air. Ah, yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, good, good. Avoid tension between high and low breath. So again, we're not trying to force it. So sometimes what happens is people are trying to really focus on that lower breath. They kind of hold their shoulders and that kind of stuff, and that can be a problem. Sometimes people also try to pull in air with their throat, right? They kind of go like, right? All of this is actually going to start to squeeze and irritate the muscles, and so that's generally the idea. So, and as I'm taking my breath, I make sure that I have some flexibility here at the same time. So it's actually my answer to your question is to integrate these two steps a little bit. Our breath and our stretching are intricately connected, and I can take a breath and then start to relax my body through the breath and let it sink back down. Then we start talking about actually starting to manipulate the pressure. So this is what I was just talking about a second ago. What's interesting here is most of singing is about resistance of air. We're not trying to blow air out. If I'm any of that kind of stuff, it's going to be really irritating on the vocal folds and can lead you towards potentially damage and strain and these kinds of things. So it's actually about resistance of airflow. When I engage these lower abdominal muscles right below my belly button, that's where I'm putting my hand right now, and I start to do this kind of stuff, I'm starting to flex those muscles and I'm learning how to come on and off of that pressure system. Now, it's not just always on. The idea is it's sort of this continuum as we add more pressure, as we push down and out against our exhale, we start to build up this pressure, and that helps us sing for our higher pitches. And then as we relax it, we sing on our lower pitches. So the idea here is we can actually overdo it on either side. If you're over engaging on a lower note, you're going to press into it. And it's going to start to close up your voice. And if you're under engaging on a higher note, our body starts to do this thing. It starts to try and compensate by collapsing the space here, and these muscles start to get really tight. So I'm starting to kind of talk about this system and how our lower breath actually helps us get mobility here in our cervical spine and in our facial muscles and all of these kinds of things. So what we're working on is engaging those muscles. And even just by doing something like this hiss thing, again, I'm not blowing out, I'm actually flexing with my lower belly and I'm going, if I let it go, it immediately all the air rushes out. So there's no problem with letting air go. And again, I'll just show it. So I'm doing this here and I'm going. There's lots of tricks to kind of help do this. Some people use a singing straw. You can blow bubbles in water. And we're starting to engage those muscles. And we're also strengthening the whole breath system. So this is this phase. We can do pulsing. We can go like. And we're just learning to kind of play with that pressure. So it's also to kind of wake up and stimulate these muscles. So part of it is I think there's a confusion here when like we go to sing. This feeling can be kind of subtle in certain moments. And so we're just trying to gain better awareness of it by kind of waking up those muscles, stimulating them, and getting some exercise for it throughout the week, as we know we're going to be doing other things with our voice. So it just helps to keep all those muscles conditioned, and you're more likely to be able to control the pressure when you breathe low into your belly and your back like that. So that's sort of this phase. There's lots to be said about that. There's some I could speak a whole hour on just breath support stuff, but we're going to talk about this framework of growing and conditioning the voice. So we'll go on to the next concept. So yeah, so we're trying to stimulate these muscles. And then we get to sort of the next phase, which I call resonance and alignment. And so all three of these things start to connect, right? If we're having trouble breathing low into our belly and our back, we start to kind of do these things where we hunch over, or maybe, it's kind of a chicken and the egg kind of thing. It's when we're hunched over like this, it's hard to engage our belly and our back. Or if we're too tight and rigid in certain ways, it's hard for us to let go those abdominal muscles. So if you're doing a lot of physical activity where you're sucking up and in, you might find, oh, I'm not actually letting go of my abdominal muscles to get truly a diaphragmatic breath where this is coming down. And again, the sensation is that your belly and your back feels like it expands. And then as we exhale, we're pushing out. So now I'm going to talk about sort of what we do with the top half. And this is a big part of the conditioning that it can be really confusing as well. We can't really consciously feel or control any of the muscles in our larynx, but we want to figure out how to make these muscles stable as they're sort of flapping at a particular frequency. And so a lot of the times we end up trying to squeeze and hold these muscles in place. And the reality is we have to do this through resonance. And the interesting concept here is when our mouth is closed, when we talk about SOVT style exercises, semi occluded vocal tract, fancy term for when your mouth is closed, it's easier to feel pressure in your belly. And it's also easier to start building up this resonance in our mouth off of our palate and through this whole vocal tract area. And that resonance actually has this sort of back pressure. And what it does is it stabilizes the muscles here. And then we're able to actually start to relax all of these external muscles. So you can see the practice is that I'm first going right to those external muscles that I know are going to try to engage and try to help. And then I go right to my breath, try to get that power source activated, which, it can get pretty sluggish, especially if you're sitting, all the time. So a lot of singers, you'll find them going from sitting to standing and trying to keep their body activated so that they can really feel that. We're going to talk about some other exercises in a second to really, really bring that home. But this is this concept. So I'm taking that low breath and everything's building off of this practice. Taking a low diaphragmatic breath. And then I'm going to go like this. When you start to hear that kind of ring, you want to do this a number of times, because as you keep doing it every time, you're going to get more and more resonance boosting, more of that sort of laser beam like sound. And it's actually going to help to stabilize the muscles. And then all of these other things start to relax. So I sit here for a sec and I focus on my breath. I make sure that I have mobility here, that I'm not immediately trying to lift up to start and sing, right? I'm sinking down and I go. Now I'm moving my lips a little bit here and move my tongue up and down. And I'm trying to make sure that I've got mobility here. And that's going to help me start to find some of these resonance spots. Our body can naturally sort of calibrate this over time. So it's a moment to just kind of listen and pay attention to what you're noticing internally as you do it. And you might find that things start to soften and relax. It's very similar feeling to when we just did the loose, sort of relaxed feeling. And then when you move your head around, and you might notice that you're starting to do some stuff and you're trying to over engage. So this is a big part of the practice, is actually releasing tension around the throat. And this is going to help your voice grow. So a lot of times what's so frustrating with singing is we're trying really hard and then we're actually squeezing our throat and we're collapsing the space. And therefore we get a smaller, more pinched kind of sound. And that's actually, it's like the opposite effect of what we want. And then we're like, oh, singing's not for me. But it's sort of the opposite path. You have to sort of find your voice through relaxation and isolation of muscles from there. So that's why I always do this practice like this. I really try to stay with it, because some weeks it's fine. And some other weeks, like I realize that I've got all this tension building and I'm trying to smooth out that energy. sort of drop into another state, this helps you a lot when you're actually performing too, right? So we're trying to save and remember that feeling every time we sing. So, of course, when we're really extra nervous and we're trying to be performative, that's when it gets extra hard and we tend to over engage stuff. So, this is a really interesting kind of balancing act that we do. So I call this sort of like vocal stretching when we're working with the shapes here of the vowels, and I'm doing like yeah, 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 wah, wah, yeah, yeah. And I'm just working on being able to have a fluid sort of motion between vowel shapes. I'm doing ya and wah, which are glides. And I do that because we're actually also feeling some of that acoustical back pressure with these smaller vowels. And then we're trying to keep some of that resonance as we open up. So you're going to feel all of these forces sort of connect. And I'm going, yeah, yeah, wah, wah, yeah, yeah, yeah. And I'm just trying to keep things moving because, again, when we start singing, we just get pretty rigid right away. It's very common. And you might find certain vowels get kind of sticky, and you're going to go like, ooh, or like the tongue's going to try to move in too sort of forceful of a way. And we're just trying to soften all of this out, keep returning to our breath. So this helps everything sort of decompress. I'll take it another step and I'll start kind of thinking about sometimes like sirens is a nice sort of way of doing vocal flexibility and sort of stretching the mechanism. And we're going like, ah. And again, I'm really trying to control that from my belly and my back, and then keep this pretty still and relaxed. Ah. Right, so all of this is just sort of hanging there, and I'm checking in with that. It seems really simple, but these exercises aren't the thing in of itself, right? It's how you respond and how you sort of approach your exercises that makes the biggest difference in terms of if you're actually building and growing and opening up your voice. So when we start to kind of stretch this out and find more resonance, hi, welcome. We're going to actually start expanding the range. The range will naturally, my teacher back in the day would say, when the notes become available to you, they naturally start to we get a wider range when the muscles can start conditioning like this. So doing that humming again seems very simple, not to be taken for granted. It actually helps to strengthen those muscles, and so doing that a little bit every practice is just going to give you benefit every time. And again, you don't have to overdo it, but it's going to actually just help your voice be more resilient as we start to condition it more. So this is why I call it sort of like stretching in some ways, where we're strengthening subtle muscles, and then we're able to better kind of move around and change the shape of this internal structure a little better. And it takes some time to get used to. So thinking about our vowel shapes and doing that kind of thing. Yeah, you're gonna find certain muscles like the jaw and certain things in the tongue and the head and the neck are gonna start to try and over engage. And we're just trying to sort of relax that away. And you're actually gonna find that your volume starts to amplify. So when we find resonance and a release in this area, the right kind of shape, it's resonance is a nice way of saying like synchronized motion. So all these things are lining up and they're starting to boost resonance. So resonance is the power that makes us louder more than anything else. If we try to create force here, it's just going to fatigue the mechanism and it's going to start to kind of shrink away. You're not going to get as much sound. So again, it's sort of backwards from what we would think. And I always say less is more. We're trying to find a sort of a balance point and remember that. And I think of it as kind of a wellness activity because you're very aware of all the tension you're holding in your body, which can be like frustrating. But this process of singing in a sort of a more relaxed and kind of meditative way can help you relax and let go of some of that stuff. So I'm sort of channeling it out of my body, using the breath. And again, it seems like all the other stuff is really helpful, but this is some of the most important stuff that we do. Now, it's going to help you find that sort of depth of tone. A lot of the times when we have sort of tightness here, we have a smaller space we're working with, and we can't actually stretch open. And so that's why we get that sort of smaller sound. Um, yeah, yes, this is great. The cracking voice thing. Again, sometimes you can own the crack, right? You can do it on purpose. There's plenty of singers who do that, particularly stylistically. So that's one thing. But let's talk about sort of the next concept here. So range, right? That's going to grow as we keep conditioning things. We'll talk about some other sort of conditioning exercise in a second. But another thing is balancing our registers. So there's kind of for every singer or for types of singers, there's sort of two opposite planes. We talk about like a lower voice singer and a higher voice singer. And it's essentially like what register do you like to use more than others? Our speaking voice register, chest voice, like mama, right? Kind of sounds a little more like my speaking voice. Now, if I'm going into head voice, it's this lighter, more hollow sort of sensation, and that's in our higher register. It's a slightly different shape of the vocal tract, and we learn how to kind of stretch, and that's partially why we do all of that work that I just talked about earlier. Now, the thing is different voice types. When you're just getting started, tend towards one or the other and have trouble in the other register. So for a lot of people who are the lower voice type, your chest voice is more dominant. And what happens is as you try to go up into head voice, it's really hard to keep that kind of shape. And so that creates a certain kind of, we'd say, younger styled voice, which is going to sound very bright and it's going to start pinching and squeezing this way. So when we learn for that kind of singer, when we learn to do some stuff like this, where we're going like yeah, or ba 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 ba, and I'm trying to get more backspace and this sort of release. That's actually going to help balance that sort of voice out and get a little more richness. There's all sorts of little exercises there. But there's also this other side too, which can be confusing. Some singers, they sound younger and their voice isn't quite getting that fullness of tone because they are more of a higher voice singer and they have trouble singing into chest voice in any sort of strident way. It's like thinking about singing immediately goes into this lighter sort of voice. And it's hard to get like emotionally sort of like get a sort of bigger kind of more brassy sound. So it's the opposite issue. And this is what's so interesting, right? For that type of singer, it sounds like a younger voice because they can't get into chest voice. And so you'll get this thing where they're like, and it kind of bottoms out. And I'm trying to get them to come back into this sort of lower area. We'll do exercises where we think more speech-like for that singer. We're going to be like, hey there. This is again more for like a soprano or really, really high tenor, often more of a soprano kind of an issue, but hey there, or na 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 na, blah 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 blah. We're trying to get lots of singing in the mask because they tend to be up here a lot. Hey, they kind of get stuck because they haven't exercised that part of their singing voice that much. So this is the game. Actually, a lot of the ways that we grow our voice is figuring out exactly what we need to condition and figuring out sort of what's dominant in our voice. So if you're somebody who is doing this a lot and you're going, and it'll start cracking because this sensation's happening. We're trying to compensate by not having enough breath pressure. And our body starts to try and collapse the space by coming forward like this. And it's really the instrument back here. So this is why I start to kind of go back and talk about the first part again, right? And this is why I spent like 20 minutes talking about that. As you're doing some of these exercises, you want to make sure that you can stay mobile with these external muscles. It's really all internal. It's right here. It's like uh, this whole sort of mechanism. And so these muscles don't need to help. In fact, that's why I'm trying to relax them right away so that they're less likely to sort of get involved. And one thing you can do is start talking about certain vowel shapes that help you get from one register to the other. So I always talk about an ah shape, kind of more neutral style shapes being really great for chest voice. And then as we go up into head voice, we need a narrow space. And we're thinking of like a very tall E or an oo is going to be really helpful in particular. So if you're saying E like this and you're going, E, that's going to be the opposite function. We need stretch back here, and it's just hard to control those muscles. So we do it by actually using vowel shapes and consonants. That's how the body already knows how to sort of control these muscles. We just have to figure out what combination we need to help bring our voice in balance. When we start to find this and the muscles start to relax and be able to sort of move into the right ideal shapes, we get more resonance pressure, and that helps keep the muscles stable, which actually helps us engage our support. So it's this whole system. If we don't have that pressure, essentially these air is escaping. We get the sound like ah, ah. You can hear it. It's kind of like these things aren't coming together in the right way. Again, we don't bring our chords together with force, and that's the issue a lot of the time, right? So resonance is our guide. When we get the right kind of spot and the right sort of shape as we sort of scan around, then it actually stabilizes our vocal folds. So I have people do this. I go, it's such a game of patience. It's like, don't move your head, don't move your head, right? You're gonna want to go, uh, and these things are gonna start to try and engage here right around the tongue and the jaw and right in this space. This is why I'm getting people to massage this, get it super relaxed, all of those feelings so that we can actually just control the back heel of our tongue going, ah. Now, I'm helping people find sort of the path of least resistance here. So the game is when we go to an eval, it's just much easier to engage in head voice. There's other tricks. I have something with troubleshooting head voice because for most people, being not our speaking voice register, it tends to be a little weaker. And so by actually working your head voice, you help the whole mechanism. You're going to help the whole range and even fullness of sound in your chest voice because you're going to get a little more height and space in it and you're going to start to fill out the whole head. So it's a difference between like, if I'm here and I'm like ah versus ah, I'm really getting a full sound around my whole head. And a lot of times we sort of see this as maturity in the voice. So this is the other thing I want to talk about, like growing your voice. Some of it happens just as we age too, right? Our body changes. The larynx, particularly for men in general, but like it's sort of different degrees, but it kind of ossifies, and the larynx gets a little more solid and sturdy as you get older. That's one example of things as they change. We naturally start to get a slightly different sound of a more mature sound. Some of it is just getting more comfortable with your technique over time and experience. You're able to relax around each note and figure out exactly where the balance is and not engage other muscles. So the release and the relaxation is huge. It actually makes your voice vibrate more, amplify, and gives it plenty of space for the vocal folds to just do what they need to do. We can't consciously control that, right? So we have to control other things. So when people try to sing with their throat, it's backfiring. You're squeezing your voice closed and potentially can lead to fatigue and injury. And that's going to make for a smaller sound. Like, versus I'm getting all that sort of space. And again, people can backfire this by trying to hold it in place. So this is why I talk about sort of scanning and going through different sort of opposite shapes to help sort of flex the muscles so that they just do it for you. So you don't have to think about it when you're singing. So the whole practice is actually to condition our muscle memory so that when we go to sing, things just tend to work in the right direction. So there's a lot actually going on with this, and having the right kind of practice can be all the difference between your voice getting bigger and more full and having a richer sound, or you can actually be practicing things that are actually doing the opposite. So that's why we're always checking in with this. Some songs that I might be trying to do, I might be getting in the way of my healthy mechanism, and I have to figure out what aspect it is. Our body changes from day to day, so we have to check in. Oh, my breath is shallow. I've been sitting in a chair for hours and hours, or my throat is sore because I've been talking a lot, And so that's the other thing I'd tell people is sometimes the best thing you can do is start being aware of these things when you're not singing. We develop a lot of habits just by talking and how we talk. So you might start to kind of just pay attention to that and start to notice when your voice starts to have fatigue and what your energy levels are like, and that's going to help you figure out when to practice and how long to practice. And that's why this is the whole point. It becomes kind of like a lifestyle, how you grow your voice, how you find balance, and it changes as you get older, and we're constantly readjusting. So it's a wellness activity because you have to be present with yourself every time you sing, and the practice helps us have some consistency so that we're not freaking out and saying, what's my body going to do today? There's always a little bit of that, but it's what's exciting about singing because it sort of we're on the tightrope, we're watching someone figuring out little things in their body so that they can have this beautiful expression, and amazing things can happen. And it's really, really beautiful to watch people defy gravity, overcome some of these things, and learn how to control their body and find strength through um, subtle isolation and not big motions. And so it's from the inside out. That's what we talk about. Um, so working with registration is actually going to be really helpful for a lot of people to grow their voice. Like, what side of the voice are you not using? And you might feel like, oh, it's terrible to sing up in head voice and be like, "Eh, and be like, well, that's just not for me. That actually means you should go there and work on it, but slowly. You can do things with like chord compression and do like a G, right? And go like, "Gee, gee, 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 gee." That helps us bring our chords together a little bit naturally without trying to squeeze external muscles. Again, we use sound shapes. So g, uh, uh. You can think of like apple or some of these other concepts. Um, the G sound, you'll notice when I go g, 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 there's a little bit of that stretch that I can get from this. And so I can go gee, 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 gee. And I'm actually kind of flexing those muscles in there and trying to get it to get a little more narrow in its shape, pulling up this way, not narrow this way, but that stretch. And that's helping my whole mechanism get into the right position so that everything can be balanced again. So singing is so much about balance between your lower body and what's happening with the resonant shape up here. And then this just sort of floats in the middle, is sort of the idea. So this is the game. Another way that we can grow our voice is finding our vibrato. So a straight tone is generally going to sound smaller because uh, it's essentially just hitting right at where the pitch is. What we do with vibrato is our body kind of oscillates around the pitch as its sort of central point. And it's just a way that our body naturally sort of protects itself. It's the muscles are contracting and relaxing so as to kind of have this nice handoff so that they're never locking in place. And so finding your vibrato can also be a great way to open up the size of your voice. With this, it's a product of healthy singing. This is why I kind of mention it now. When you start to get more resonance, more connection to your belly and your back, you're going to start to get that vibrato happening naturally. So there's a sensation of releasing into this. And I'll do things to kind of trick myself into vibrato, right? One of the games, try not try. Like when you think about trying to do something that's more subconscious, we tend to just stop it from happening, right? And so this gets really tricky. This is part of why you kind of have to lull yourself, hypnotize yourself into a meditative place. And then I practice changing directions and I listen for vibrato at the ends of my phrases. I have a whole thing on this too. So check that out as well if you're like, what is he talking about? So I'll go like this, straight tone is ah, and then vibrato ah. It's going to start to ah, kind of oscillate, ah, and it's a natural occurrence. Again, I'm not forcing this. I'm not going like ah. If you see your head moving a lot, it's a backup of pressure. It's generally a sign that things can relax here. If your jaw is doing the kind of thing like that, that's also maybe a little bit more of a backup of pressure. It's a sign that you're doing a little too much or something is over engaged in a certain place or locking in place. And so go back to this, try to keep that relaxed. It's in the sound and the resonance where that really is happening. And so it's what I'll do is I'll kind of flick back and forth. I'll go like hi 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 and I'll do this in different places and be like hi 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 hi. Also, just finding generally more back placement really helps people with this. So thinking more classical. Hi 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 and I try to go really quickly like away way, and you'll start to notice yourself kind of falling into this or starting and stopping, being like, ha, ha, ha. Um, Once you start to find just exactly the right position for certain notes, for the vowel shape and the right kind of pressure for certain notes, you can just start to drop into it. You do it from your breath, and you're like, yeah. And that's when you're most likely to get your vibrato to happen. You've just kind of pinpointed exactly that spot. Um, so we're kind of like surfers or skiers. We're sort of finding balance points on a continually changing system, and the system is our breath. And so working our breath helps us touch base with that. And then we learn how to ride it. So I would say the golden rule of singing is that we're riding our breath. It's on our breath, and it starts and ends our voice essentially is our it's our breath. So that vibrato is a way that you can start to kind of open things up. Also I just wanted to go back a little bit for the person who mentioned a cracking voice, I think is what you meant there. And another trick that people will do is use the straw mechanism. This is also kind of one of those SOVT style things. And so that's going to help you stabilize the muscles as well. So sometimes we're cracking because we're over singing and we're trying to do something to make it happen versus actually the right kind of stretch and change in shape and position. So when we go like this, we can learn how to kind of properly transition from these two states. Same thing again when I'm going like, it just helps you become more aware. If there's a little crack moment, it's sort of stalling out and misaligning, right? Think about like a car when it's trying to change gears, it sort of like gets stuck in between, and that's when that sort of cracking thing will happen. So we do it by gently sliding up and down and trying to transition. And using the straw thing can be very, very helpful. So I recommend that for you since you mentioned it. But yeah, you might want to think about like what register, when am I cracking, and where do I tend to crack, and then learn how to relax those muscles so that they don't do some sort of flinch thing, build up pressure, and then have to sort of pop into the other zone. So essentially, that's what's happening. Is we're building up pressure because we're stuck in one position, and the body's like, no, 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 I got to go the other way, and so it'll just kind of bail up there. We can do that on purpose, right? We can be like, oh, hey, yeah, right, and that's yodeling. These kinds of concepts. So some of my points here are like when we try to avoid things, we tend to get kind of rigid too. And so we just learn how to control them. We play around with that in our practice. And then your voice starts to grow and it starts to open up because it's getting healthier. So this is a big part of this. Um, Oftentimes, again, the volume gets bigger when we have more resonance and more release of space here. Um, let's talk about some other tricks too. I think that are just fun to kind of stimulate the body in the right way. Support can be really hard, like this breath pressure down here, and we just want some other things that can start to kind of work the system. One that I don't mention a lot, just for anyone who comes to these often, is using staccato work. And this is a great way to make sure that you're just in that right position, like what I mentioned earlier. How do you kind of set up ahead of time? And you're like, go to sing, and you make sure that you're not pushing with anything here. So staccato is a short burst. So we're going like something like this, like ha 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 ha, and we're trying to hit that pitch. And you'll realize it's really hard to get just right on that pitch in accuracy. Some of it's just like a focus with our mind. If you're like, this is really hard to do, an easy sort of sensation into it is thinking about when we belly laugh or giggle. So I kind of think of the slightly maniacal laugh, and be like, ha 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 ha, and I'm not going like because that's too much of this stuff. Not that. So don't go too far into your character. But we're trying to get the stimulation down here. So it's ha 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 ha, right? That feeling of that belly popping out. And you can see that we already do that a lot. Like, ha 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 ha, right? That engagement there. We're gonna start to work the muscles. Now let's do it with notes. And we're gonna go like this, like ha 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 ha. And again, loose targets. It's gonna be really hard to get exactly on pitch with these. We're trying to feel like gradually adding more intensity. Ha 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 ha, and not letting this do too much. We're not squeezing or pressing on anything. And then you can actually start to really exercise these muscles by going like ha 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 ha, and you can keep going higher and higher. This exercise keeps building, or you can do repeated notes and be like ha 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 ha. Whew, right, you'll actually start to feel some work out there, and you'll realize it's like our lower body can get kind of sluggish, right? And so you might notice that actually helps you get deeper into your diaphragmatic breathing. every single part of the practice helps with the other things. So I'm constantly just sort of juggling back and forth and trying to find balance between all of the systems. This is just explaining the practice in general and how do we grow our voice through a practice like this. There's lots of them. There's different ways. They should be following general principles of voice science. So that's something you can look out for. And like, is this actually working right? So we've got some deductive reasoning, which is like the studies and questions that we ask. And then we've got some of the, well, it's a little more inductive too in its own way. But we also have our feeling from uh, just from day to day. And that's also something that we have to judge with as well. So we use both of these things, like our voice science, and then we use sort of our just what does it feel like today, checking in and doing some of these exercises. And over time, your voice gets stronger and more resilient, and you're able to do more and more things and access higher notes, and there's more availability. That's what my teacher says again is when the notes become available to you, the concept of letting your body be breathed, right? Letting the system sort of take over rather than trying to have a concerted breath and be like, all this kind of stuff. That's rigid. We're controlling and we're muscling that too much. So these kinds of terms come up a lot with singers. Oh, I was fighting myself the whole time because I didn't have a practice where I could get my sort of voice in the right sort of balance before I started doing my rehearsal, et cetera, et cetera. That's what this practice is really about. So yeah, that staccato thing, actually, just by kind of doing that a little bit here and there, you're actually gonna start to wake up those muscles, and then you're able to like mama. The other one that I wanted to mention too is really using our consonants to help us feel our pressure as well. We talked about resonance, doing like you can do like mm, mm, zzz, zzz, all of these kinds of things. As long as you're staying soft here, they help us also connect. So what I'm doing is sometimes I'm trying to find stability with my voice at a certain spot with the consonant first, and do this generally in this lower to middle range, not too high, because then we can really lock in place. We want to be careful and learn this in a lower place first. But I'll literally be like, "Mm, mm, and I'm listening for that resonance. Do I start to feel that? Do I have stability with the muscles here? I'm not trying to push them, but and then as I open up and relax, I try to maintain that same feeling and I engage my body a little more. My belly comes out to help support the space as it opens, right? All the air can escape, and I might be like, ma, right? And that's going to be a bad habit. So I'm helping sort of build that stability into my voice and go like, mama. And again, the habits are that we're going to want to do this. So move your head around. Be like, get yourself able to move around the shape. Mama. And then you're going to have to actually find better balance. So by doing this a little bit every other day or so, small increments, once a week. It doesn't have to be all the time. Sometimes people are overworking, right? And then they're not letting their body decompress and sort of learn in its own way by relaxing and sleeping and those kinds of things. But if you do this bit by bit, you're actually training those muscles to get stronger and be more stretchy, more elastic. And you don't have to do it by trying, but by force. It's kind of these subtle little things. Because again, it's hard to feel our voice, what we think of typically as our voice. So we use these other sensations to get a sense of things like, do I have resonance in my sound? Is my head and my neck relaxed? Do I have mobility here? Do I generally feel some sensation in my lower belly? Am I breathing down there? These are the things that we really are looking out for as singers, and generally just trying to get out of the way here. So um, this is the game, like we're doing all of these little things to stretch and condition the voice so that we can start singing with it. We're building up energy essentially, and we can start working with our voice more, and we can start doing drills and stylistic work and such. But first we have to build up that energy. Again, think like an athlete, right? When you first start running, you're gonna be like doing all this kind of stuff, right, for a second. Then it gets more and more refined, and then eventually you kind of detach for a second. You're in that sort of runner's high, and like your body is able to kind of take over for you a little bit, and you can pilot it from a slightly more detached place. It's just sort of some examples. Um, just over time, you condition it, you rest, and you come back, and it's going to be a little more resilient if you've been conditioning it in the right way. So this is the vocal practice, and this is what I talk about, and it's a little different from what people expect sometimes. It's more like a yoga routine, and again, we have to always be paying attention to what we're feeling, and this is the process to growing your voice. And it's a little different from some of the other things, right? Like, yes, we grow by learning songs and having expression and all these other things. They're a big part of it, but the technical sort of growth and resilience of the voice comes from these subtle little flexes. That's why we make some silly sounds sometimes, and you have to sort of detach yourself from the silliness of it because it's less about the words and like what those words mean. You know, if I'm going like cut or something like that, it's like that's really ridiculous. But it's more about the sensations and what it causes the muscles to do as we make each of those shapes. Having a little bit of extra repetition and a little more mindfulness as you do it, and you're going to start to actually get the voice in the right proper place, and you're going to have more energy, and your voice is going to be able to do more stuff without you even really feeling it that much. Sometimes we attach we emotionally attach to like I'm doing a good job because I'm really engaging, and that tends to actually set us back as a singer, and it makes our voice squeeze and get a little smaller. And so we want to sink back and relax into it and trust our body and trust our muscle memory. And then we're just sort of floating. We're soaring through our music and we just watch it and we listen and we try to keep that balance going. And that's really what's going on a lot of the time. So it's a lot of focus. You'll see singers sometimes like going inward. They're thinking about their body and trying to sort of pilot some of these things. And ultimately, if you're not preparing ahead of time and working this into your muscle memory, you're going to be a nervous wreck performing because you don't know what's going to happen really. And that can be really terrifying. So I was, as a classic sort of statement, but if you're failing to prepare, you're preparing to fail, right? So with singing, we have to get this sort of sensations like ahead of time, and that allows you to just kind of be there and have that presence. And once someone's worked something into their body, it almost looks like not much is happening because they're finding balance in all of these moments in their voice. And that's what's so weird about it, right? So and people are like, oh, you must have been born that way. And it's like, no, the art form is about sort of looking effortless and about finding a balance point at each moment, and then that you're not doing all this extra stuff. So that's why we're trying to find stillness. We're really thinking and breathing, and stopping between exercises and then being like, okay, how did that feel? And then reapproaching it, right? That those things are going to be really, really helpful in your practice. Yeah. Does anyone have any questions about this? I know like I'm sort of rapid firing with this because it's a lot to talk about, but this is the process of growth. Some of it is some technical stuff like finding vibrato, thinking about sort of how you balance your tone. So if you have a really bright tone, you want to try to find the opposite, and that's going to help you find a more full, more balanced tone. And then you can learn to control on either side. And again, it may be not your style, but finding the opposite sort of register, like head voice or chest voice, depending, will help you find balance in general with the whole mechanism. So sometimes doing certain exercises, singing classically, these kinds of things can be really helpful, even if you're not doing the style, right? Like it's just helping condition the muscles and gain more resiliency. So it's like I always say, like classical music is like the Olympics of singing, right? We're doing all this really crazy stuff and these big feats and with a big sound over with an orchestra. We don't necessarily have amplification through a microphone. And so we have to make this big voice happen. And it's through subtle conditioning. And then it becomes this very athletic sort of experience. Once you get used to doing that, sometimes singing contemporary music feels like a much smaller thing. It just feels easier in some respects, as long as you're doing the right sort of stylistic changes and are used to that as well. So, yeah, this is sort of the game, right? Finding balance. Like, what parts of your voice are lacking? Is it hard to take that deep breath? Are you really tight? Like these things they take time. Like if only I had a more relaxed jaw, right? That's the thing that happens all the time for singers. They're like, oh, I realize my jaw is just like really stuck and I can't get that to relax. And it's sort of pulling the whole mechanism a little bit, making it too rigid. So yeah, this is sort of the game. Think if I've got anything else we can add to it. Yeah, the size of the voice grows with age, right? It's like as you start to do more of this stuff, your voice will naturally start to get bigger. And sometimes, strangely so, like you can barely feel it. Um, so it's like, sometimes I have to check myself by just listening to recordings and stuff because you might feel like you're not doing very much and then realize, oh, I'm making a pretty big sound. And then sometimes, because you're not feeling it, we try to start doing too much, right? We try to emulate the big feeling. This happens like when you're with an orchestra and stuff like that. You're trying to like be with it, and that actually does the opposite. It backfires, right? So it's more about precision and finding balance and sinking into your body and keeping this nice and relaxed and kind of lined up when in doubt. So that's really the game. And it's all about the resonance plus the pressure. So we're working on muscles to help strengthen all of that breath system. There's lots of different options. So working the diaphragm indirectly, right, through breathing through our belly and our back, doing things like lip trills, right? That's also an SOVT kind of thing, right? Going like I don't really like teach with that as one of the like main tenets of my practice because it can be hard for some people to do until you've learned to isolate these muscles more appropriately. But also for the person who mentioned voice cracking, lip trills can be very very helpful to strengthen your voice so that it's less likely to do that as well. Ultimately, when you're having issues, find a teacher because getting some outside feedback and a mirroring is really really helpful just to show people what they might be doing because again some of it is subconscious coordination. It's really hard to tell when you're doing it. It's almost like comical sometimes, right? Like I always talk about like with my teacher back in the day, every time I go to sing a high note there's this moment in time in my practice where I kind of like look up to the left corner and she'd be like, what are you looking at? And it's like, I don't know, the sound, I guess. I'm like trying to like and then we get all like stuck in these positions. And you'll notice singers will do stuff like this because they're like navigating that space that they're sort of we create like an analog space to think about pitches and that sensation as it moves up and down our vocal tract. We feel it kind of in our whole body, which is very confusing. Um, yes, yes, exactly. And when you record yourself, you definitely hear yourself differently than in reality. And some of that is bone resonance. It's just our perspective. We are in our own body, and so we hear it kind of more internally through that resonance. Um, and versus air resonance, what people hear externally like this. So what we'll do is sometimes it's as simple as this, but if you put your hand in the right position, it bounces off, goes right into your ear, and you'll all of a sudden be like, oh, whoa. And you'll start talking with more resonance, actually. This is like sort of a trick for a lot of actors too. You realize, oh, I changed the style of talking when I hear what it does in the airspace. And that's going to help me kind of line up and have more resonance to get my sound out, right? Resonance makes your sound carry all over the place without necessarily having to like be super forceful, right? That's the big game with this. And that, because the voice is a tiny little thing. If you think about the vocal folds in here, uh, like size of a dime to a quarter, right? Tiny little bit of material. And you can see why it can get so fatigued so quickly and why we have to be really careful about our practice. So, sometimes people get really excited and then they overdo it and they're over exercising. And then, same thing, you're going to have to recover and you got out of your energetic cycle and flow. And learn being a good singing teacher and being a good singer in general is being very aware of your energetic flow, right? If you're feeling sick and tired, do some things to help build that energy up and don't try to just, abuse your voice and try to push it out, right? Because that's going to set you back in your practice. And, your voice is going to take some time to essentially open up again. You can't force that to happen. It's really just checking in with our body. So yeah, and the other thing I was going to mention too, when you record yourself, this is kind of just like an important thing to think about: the technology that's picking it up, what you're doing with the software. All of these things are going to change the way that you approach your voice. It's kind of like you're singing through a prism, right? And it's coming out slightly different, right? So even great singers can sound really terrible on certain mics with certain kinds of things. I mean, hilariously so, or just like very, very different, right? And so finding the right kind of sound as you're recording is really, really essential too, rather than just trying to like push a lot to make it to force it in place. It's sort of like a weird target game where you're like, shooting into the prism at just the right angle so that it comes out based on how you hear it at just the right sort of way. And that's why the flexibility and all of that stuff is so helpful and important because you can do very little things sometimes, just like in film acting, right? Where that make have a big effect to others. So when in doubt, actually, we tend to overdo stuff, right? And then it sounds kind of silly. We over enunciate, we over engage things, and it just doesn't have that sort of effortless, cool, just perfectly tweaked vibe. So yeah, that's the art form. And I say move things in a big way, get a sense of your mechanism first, right? Are you or and opening up the whole space and getting all of that. Um, with recording, it's kind of an interesting head game, and at some point, I should do a whole thing on sort of this thing. It just depends on what you're singing, right? Sometimes there's so much to be said about position with the microphone. In general, we get really rigid when we're recording because you have to be. We try to stay in a certain spot. So I would just say, like, if you're doing a lot of recording, make sure you take breaks and go back to doing this kind of stuff. Reconnect with your breath, find a position that's comfortable that you can sing in, right? So if you're like finding yourself all out of, like kind of out in a weird angle, trying to get it to happen, that's kind of be the worst thing. And then of course, something about recording, just like one little tidbit is like when you start listening to something over and over again, we get kind of lost in it. And sometimes it's kind of hilarious. This is just I think a lot of people can relate to this. So your first few takes are often better than the things you do way down the line. Not necessarily, but like we keep trying it, and then we get in these vicious cycles. And you realize, oh, it was great when it was just like fresh and I wasn't overthinking it. So sometimes you have to take a break, take a walk, come back to it on a different day, rather than just trying to like push it out, right? So a lot of people, when in recording process and that repetition, can develop a lot of vocal fatigue and injury because time is money and people are there and they're trying to get the best sort of thing happening. But at the same time, it changes from day to day, and we get sort of in our head and then we over muscle things, and it's really hard to let go of that muscle memory. So again, just a plug for the practice. That's why we come back to resetting things, stretching, doing self-care tricks, deep breathing, recentering, finding your resonance and alignment again. And that's actually going to do a world of help, even more so than drills, right? If you're in the moment, like performing or recording, do that kind of stuff to actually just help you stay centered. And you're going to find that your voice tends to work better for you. At least that's been my experience. So yeah, hopefully this has been helpful. I'm just kind of shooting out lots of different things because it's sort of like how to grow your voice to me is sort of like a plug for of the practice itself, and like why we as singers and professional singers in particular, why we need a practice, and we use that practice to make sure that we're staying healthy and that we're not getting into trouble, because ultimately once you have more and more demand, you have to be really conscientious of that. Otherwise, you run into issues, and time is money. And sometimes when lots of people are showing up, right, to something, you're like, I have to do it, right? Because everybody's there and it's in concert. And so you have to treat yourself like an athlete, right? If you're gonna have a big performance, like take care of yourself, get some energy, sleep, eat, drink water, and make sure that you're staying calm, and try to, it'll help your body, it'll help your whole voice. So that's that. You guys are very welcome as always. Oh, and I think big announcement I think I can say is I will be alternating with Camille now. So she's back in business and we'll be going back and forth, which I think will just be great to have different takes, and we can kind of like shoot off of each other on certain concepts. And I think that's going to be really exciting. So I'm going to be off for a few weeks and then I'll be back on for a few weeks. And I hope you guys enjoy all of that. So have a good rest of the day, and I will catch you guys when I see you next. Bye.